February 21st. The committee assistant sent those out. Do I have a motion on the minutes? I have a motion from Representative Neighbor. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I move that we accept the minutes as written for February 21st, 2023.
Okay, I've got a motion by Representative Neighbor, a second by Representative Howerton. Is there any discussion?
You might want to change in the agenda to 2023.
Yes, yes. We are not approving the 2022 minutes today, so thank you.
I want to check.
Okay.
No, okay.
I have a motion to approve the minutes of February 21st, 2023. Is there any discussion? Okay, seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed, nay. Okay, the ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. Our next order of business is an informational hearing on the legislative post-audit part 1 of election security. Kansas's procedures for election security, and I'd like to welcome to the committee Andy Brienzo. Did I say that right? Okay, welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. So this is actually part 1 of what has become a 2-part audit. It was initially approved as a single 5-question audit. This part 1 addresses what were originally questions 3, 4, and 5. And if you turn to page 2, or scroll to page 2, I guess, as the case may be, you'll see the questions in our introductory section. So the 3 questions that this addresses are whether county election officers receive adequate training to administer federal elections, how Kansas's practices for maintaining, using, and sharing ballot images and cast vote records compared to other states, and then what practices and policies and practices do the Secretary of State and county election officers have to protect the integrity of voting for long-term care facility residents? So I'll be taking those one at a time as we arrive at them as we go through the report. So let's flip to page 4 first, or scroll to page 4. I'm probably going to say flip a lot because I'm used to doing this from a paper report, but you can scroll instead. Okay, so the answer to question 1 is at the top of page 4. And it is, as you can see there, county election officers told us they felt prepared to oversee elections, but we couldn't verify training for officers or workers because this generally is not tracked. So as you can see on pages 4 and 5, we have some sort of background setup information, so I'm going to go through that quickly here. As you can see primarily in figure 1 on page 4, elections are very complex processes. They require a lot of people, a lot of different procedures. They have to happen within specified timeframes, which of course adds to the complexity. And so in our estimation, in order to be prepared to oversee and administer such a complex set of processes and procedures, training is important. So as you can see on pages, or at the bottom of page 5 there, Kansas has 105 counties. Obviously 101 of those, their election office is led by the elected county clerk. They are the county election officer. In the 4 most populous counties, Johnson, Sedgwick, Shawnee, and Wyandotte, the Secretary of State's office appoints an election commissioner, and they are the chief county election officer. And these people they're overseeing all aspects of election processes in their counties. So they're doing things like maintaining voter registrations, accepting candidate filing, choosing the polling places, and appointing election workers. And we describe those more at the bottom of page 5. So these are the people that do the frontline election duties. Obviously, there's way too much for one person to do, the county election officer. And so they appoint workers to help them out with this. And these are the people who sort of your average voter is going to interact with on election day. It's the person who checks them in, hands them the ballot, collects it when they're finished. And so obviously their preparation is important as well. So let's go to page 6. And you'll see there that we reviewed state law to see what the requirements were for both of these groups. So the county election officers and the workers, to see what was required of them. And as you'll see there on page 6, we found that the requirements are very sparse. So let's start with the county election officers. At the top of the page, you'll see that statute only requires them to receive training relating to their duties. That's it. And the Secretary of State's office is charged with determining what this should look like, so determining the content and delivery of this training. And what they told us is that every year at the Kansas County Clerks and Election Officials Association, or the KCCEOA conference, they sort of take over one of the training sessions and they provide about a half day of training to the county election officers. Now, what we intended to do was determine whether this training that they're getting was adequate in terms of preparing them to oversee elections in their counties. But we had trouble with that, as you can see on page 7. So the first reason for this was because statute is so sparse, we couldn't define and measure what adequate training would look like, okay? We also didn't find any federal requirements or best practices, so we just didn't have anything concrete to measure against. You'll see also there on page 7 that neither the Secretary of State's office nor the KCCEOA is tracking who is attending this annual training. And so from that perspective, from purely the perspective of determining who is going to this, we couldn't determine adequacy either. Okay, so that's the officers. Let's return to the bottom of page 6 and talk about the election workers, so those frontline election workers who are doing the bulk of the work on election day. You'll see that statute is similarly sparse in this regard, so statute only requires that county election officers provide them training before each election. Kansas statute defines the primary and general elections as distinct, so we expected to see training before each type of election rather than before each election cycle. And we reviewed sort of what a handful of counties are doing. And you can see some details about what their trainings look like, because as I said, it's up to the election officer to decide what this should look like. So they looked very different across counties like Johnson and Chase, for instance, which obviously have very different local contexts. And you can see some detail about that on 6 and the top of page 7. We also reviewed whether a handful of counties trained their workers prior to the 2022 general election. You can see this at the bottom of page 7 and then sort of the top half of page 8. We reviewed Chase, Douglas, Ford, Harvey, Jackson, Johnson, Riley, and Wyandotte. So it's just a selection to see whether they met this training requirement in state law. You can see that of those, Harvey, Riley, and Wyandotte, they gave us documentation showing that they trained all of their workers before the 2022 general election. At the top of page 8, you'll see there were 2 counties, this is Douglas and Johnson, that didn't train all of their workers before the general election in 2022. So 50 of 312 in Douglas County, which is about 16%, weren't trained before that election. 27 of those had been trained before the primary election last year, so it's only about 3 months difference. We thought the effect was probably pretty minimal. 21 others were trained in a previous year, so they did have some experience, some background. It was just sort of older training. And then we couldn't find training records for 2. Moving on to Johnson County there at the top of page 8, so 33 of about 1,500, or about 2%, weren't trained before the 2022 general election. 26 of those had been trained before the 22 primary, again, so only a few months beforehand. 5 had been trained in previous years, and then 2 had never been trained. So I want to stress that these are very, very small numbers. Obviously, 2 out of 1,500 in Johnson County is very small objectively. And then we had 3 counties that either didn't provide us with documentation, or they gave us documentation that we couldn't confirm. This is Chase, Ford, and Jackson counties. And these are smaller counties, obviously, with smaller numbers of election workers, so it's entirely possible that without large formalized tracking processes of the kind that we see in Douglas and Johnson, they could be tracking whether their workers are being trained, and we just couldn't see documentation along those lines. Okay, so that was our review of state law, training requirements, and whether they are attending the trainings that they're supposed to be. We also supplemented that with a survey, and you can see this on pages 8, 9, and 10. And we asked a couple of different sort of groupings of questions of county election officers. Some of the questions related to whether they felt like they were prepared. So even though we couldn't determine whether they had been trained in the way that they were supposed to be, we could get a sense of whether they felt like they were ready to do their jobs. You can see some of those answers at the top of page 9. And you'll see that overall they reported feeling very prepared. On page 10, you'll see that we also asked about the trainings that they were getting from the Secretary of State's office. And for those who were getting trainings elsewhere, which was a minority of them, we asked about those trainings too. So a good example of this would be in Figure 3. The top line is asking about how relevant the topics that the Secretary of State's office training covered were to their roles as, overseeing and administering their elections in their county, and overwhelmingly 97% said that they were extremely or very relevant. So they had positive things to say overall about the Secretary of State's office's training. At the bottom of page 10, you'll see that we got some specific feedback from county election officers who filled out the survey about certain types of training that they wanted to see, or things that they wanted the Secretary of State's office to do a bit differently. You can see those details there. Moving on to page 11, you'll see that we also looked at 5 other states. So this is Colorado, Florida, Maryland, Missouri, and Utah, to see how their training requirements compared to Kansas's, which, as I said before, were very sparse. So 3 of these 5 states, they required, or in some cases financially incented, election officers to receive more training than Kansas. And I'll use Colorado as an example. You can see this towards the middle of page 11. So Colorado required county election officers to complete a very highly structured, robust certification program. It has specific format, curriculum, number of hours, frequency. You can see some more details there. There were continuing professional education requirements. Going into the audit, we sort of assumed that something similar would be in place in Kansas. Of course, we found that wasn't the case. Conversely, you can see towards the bottom of that section at the top of page 11 that neither Missouri nor Utah had any statewide training requirements. So that's obviously the other extreme. On the bottom of page 11, we also looked at these states' requirements for the workers, the election workers. And 3 of the 5 had more state-level involvement in what the election workers were getting from their county election officers. And here I'll use Maryland as an example. So they required that the county election officers use a state-created training program created by the State Board of Elections, and it covered a lot of those frontline election duties that workers have to execute. And conversely, again, you can see at the middle of page 12 that Utah had no requirements at all. So that's our answer to question 1. Question 2 the answer begins at the middle of page 12, and I will remind you what it was. So it was, how do Kansas's practices for maintaining, using, and sharing ballot images and cast vote records compare to other states' practices? We used the same 5 states, Colorado, Florida, Maryland, Missouri, and Utah, and we found that Kansas maintains and uses ballot images and cast vote records similarly to most of these states, but is more restrictive than some about sharing them. So, and I will get into the details that underpin that in a moment, but actually I want to flip to page 14 and figure 4. So you can see in figure 4 that we have here an example that we pulled from Maryland of a ballot image on the right of the figure and a cast vote record on the left. So the ballot image is just an image of a ballot. So when a voter fills out their ballot and it's completed and ready to be tabulated, in most counties, it will go through an optical scanner to be read. Now, when it goes through the scanner, if it has the capability, and not all do, it will take just a literal image of the ballot and store it, and then the county election office can view it later. The cast vote record on the left is an indicator of what the tabulator read. So when a tabulator, an optical scanner, has the capability of creating a cast vote record, which they don't all, just like ballot images, it will create this text file that shows how it read and interpreted the voter's intent. So in this particular instance, you can see that the tabulator was able to understand this voter's, and these go together, by the way, it was able to understand this voter's intent for comptroller, attorney general, and U.S. senator. They each have one green line that shows how the tabulator counted this person's votes. You'll see, though, that when it came to the governor's race, it had a greater challenge. You can look on the ballot image and see that 2 of the selections or the options were selected by the voter. So then when it ran through the tabulator, it couldn't determine which one it was supposed to count. Now, this is a great example of what county election officers told us they are using this technology for. So when a tabulator is unable to interpret what the voter intended, they can pull up the ballot image, review a literal image of the ballot, and decide for themselves what they think the voter intended. The other primary use that we heard about from county election officers was in the post-election audit. So when you have tens or hundreds of thousands of ballots in a large county like Johnson County, let's say, where they have 250,000 ballots in a given election, it's more efficient to query the database of ballot images to find the precincts that they're auditing and then review from there, rather than look through them manually. Okay, you can see at the top of page 15 that there's no requirement in state law that counties use these things. And as I mentioned, not all scanners are capable of creating them. So 2 of the 6 counties that we reviewed had scanners that couldn't create these ballot images. There was an optional extra that their vendor wanted to charge them more for. They didn't think they needed it, so they didn't buy it, that capability. 4 of the 6 had scanners that couldn't create cast vote records. Similar story, they just didn't think they needed it, so they didn't purchase that functionality. As I mentioned, we reviewed what other states are doing in this space, so we reviewed those 5 states that I mentioned previously. You can see the results at the bottom of page 15 and all of page 16. The sort of baseline takeaway from this work was that Kansas does not have the same type of clear state-level guidance for counties that we found in the other states that we reviewed. So as you can see at the bottom of page 15 and onto the top of page 16, all the other states maintain ballot images and cast vote records for the same 22 months that they're maintaining paper ballots. In Kansas, the counties that we talked to, it's situationally specific. It depends on more practical considerations like how much hard drive space they have, because there's no requirement in state law that they keep them for the same amount of time that they keep paper ballots, because they're not mentioned at all in the law. You'll see that in most of the states that we reviewed, they are using these technologies, these digital copies of ballots, for the same types of purposes that we found were common in Kansas. So that's the adjudicating unclear ballots and the post-election audit. And then when it comes to sharing, this is where some of the biggest differences came in. So in Kansas, even though there's not good guidance about whether these things are secret, the counties that we talked to, they're erring on the side of caution and keeping them secret even when they're getting core requests for them because the paper ballot is secret. In the other states that we reviewed, there's greater state-level guidance when it's secret. So for instance, Missouri and Utah make it clear in statute, they're secret and they shouldn't be shared. Colorado, Florida, and Maryland, they make these things public, and that's clear in statute. And in Colorado and Maryland, they stand up databases and they make these things easily accessible to the public. On page 17, you'll see that we talked with officials about some of the transparency benefits, the pros and cons of making these things public. So as I said, they're treated as secret currently. But if they were to be made public, we heard about potential increases in public trust because there's greater transparency into the election process. The negative side was the technological requirements of making these things public. So first, every county would need scanners that were capable of creating them, which is not currently the case. And if the state wanted to create a database, for instance, like Colorado or Maryland, that could be a pretty big technological lift. Secretary of State's office also mentioned that they had concerns related to people's expectations that their ballots are secret. So they said they get questions along these lines. And so they thought that people would feel like maybe their privacy had been violated if ballot images and cast vote records that showed how they voted were made public. And then one election official told us that there would be some serious concerns about security from their perspective. So they would want to make sure that people can't download images of ballots, doctor them, and then distribute them to show something that is different from the actual election results. Okay, so that was question 2. If you move with me to page 18, you will see question 3. And as a reminder, again, what policies and practices do the Secretary of State and county election officers have to protect the integrity of voting for long-term care facility residents? You'll see the answer is at the top of page 18. Facility and county election officials described having a few basic practices to protect voting in long-term care facilities. So just to be clear, you can see this on page 18 at the top there. We're talking about places like nursing homes, assisted living facilities. They offer varying levels of care to their residents, but these are people who are living full-time in facilities. At the bottom of page 18 and on the top of page 19, you'll see that we looked for national level literature, best practices about this. And what we found was sparse. A lot of it was dated. There just wasn't a lot that spoke directly to this. The broad strokes takeaway, I would say, you can see at the bottom of page 18 and onto page 19, that in order to prevent fraud and undue influence, the two sort of areas that the best practice recommended focusing on were improving residents' voting access and their access to information to make sure that they feel like they can make a well-informed decision and are not unduly relying on others to tell them how to vote. Okay, so at the bottom of page 19, you'll see that we reviewed state law, and again, we found that it was fairly sparse. So there was a few very basic practices that overlapped with some of the best practices that we saw in the national literature, but they weren't specifically, they didn't specifically mention long-term care facility fraud and undue influence. A good example of this would be at the bottom of page 19. You'll see that state law says officials must let certain voters choose who help them fill out their ballots. Or if they're voting in a polling place, the county has to provide them with a bipartisan team of assistance if they need it. There are some optional practices too. You'll see this at the bottom of page 19 and onto the top of page 20. So for instance, counties can but are not required to set up mobile polling places. So this would be a polling place that's actually in the facility that is exclusively for the use of the facility residents. That would, of course, make it very easy for them to vote, improving their access to voting. At the bottom of page 20 and the top of page 21, you'll see that we reviewed 7 facilities, and we talked to officials from 3 counties to kind of get a sense of what they did, what their practices were about this, and how they compared to state law and best practices. You'll see that in general, I think the main takeaway is that they relied mostly on their normal practices. So a great example of this would be voting by mail. So most of the residents of facilities like this are mail-in voters. And the facilities that we talked to, with a couple of exceptions, just rely on their normal mail process. So when the person fills out their ballot, it goes in the same communal mailbox that they use for all other mail. USPS picks it up, takes it away. Something special about the process just because it's a ballot. County election officials, this is primarily on page 21, describe something similar. They meet the basic requirements of state law, but they don't do some of the optional things that we found in state law, like setting up those mobile polling places. And that is the meat of the audit. If you go down to the bottom of page 21, you'll see that we had a few recommendations. So the first one was to the Secretary of State's office. We recommended that they more proactively hold county election officers accountable for receiving that annual training that they're supposed to, according to state law. And we thought that could include requiring and tracking training session attendance. You'll see at the bottom of page 21 and all of page 22 that they rejected that recommendation, and they provide their rationale for that there. At the top of page 23, you'll see we also had a couple of legislative recommendations. So we thought the legislature should consider amending state law to strengthen the training requirements for both county election officers and workers, which, as I mentioned, were pretty sparse, especially compared to the other states that we reviewed. And then the third one there is the legislature should consider amending state law to clarify how ballot images and cast vote records should be maintained and shared in cases where counties decide to use them. And with that, I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Mr. Vice Chairman.
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know if you guys would be aware of this, but I was thinking, I was in Fenn State last year, and there was a bill on county election worker training. Well, was there not anything new that got, I mean, maybe Secretary of State's office can, yeah, I think you were.
Representative Howell
Representative Howell
has an answer.
Thank you, Chair. That was my bill.
Bill.
So I'm intimately familiar with it. It did not make it through the process. So, and I did not pursue it this year. I decided to give the Secretary of State's office a little bit of time and see what they handled on their own.
Did that die in committee or?
It actually died in conference committee.
Okay. You have another question? Yeah, please.
I know the question has always come up with long-term care facilities about, I mean, mail-in ballots are always, it's different. You don't have the privacy of the voting booth. You have somebody trying to assist you. Did you have any sense of concern from these long-term care facilities that somehow residents were being unduly influenced by anyone? I mean, was there any sensibility that, or was that beyond the scope of what you looked for?
So I would say, if you're asking about sort of our sense from speaking with them, I would say that there was not a great deal of concern that came out of conversations with them about widespread fraud or undue influence in their facilities with their residents.
Okay.
And I think that's probably primarily why they just rely on their normal processes in terms of both, delivering and collecting mail-in ballots, but also when people needed assistance with things like filling out their ballot, they primarily just use their normal process. So some of the facilities have a social worker on staff who's there to just help with whatever the residents need. And so if they needed help voting, it would be just the social worker who would do that just like they would help with anything else. So again, they're sort of just using their normal processes that they use in day-to-day life, which suggests to me that there's not a lot of focus on this particular issue.
Representative Neighbor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Based on your, this part one of your audit, did you come up with any feeling that there's a loss of integrity or opportunity for people to commit fraud based on what you saw during your research? And because I know we've heard from the Secretary of State's office that they were confident and that Kansas was really a role model. So I just wondered how that played into what you had as a response here.
So I would say that although these topics are related to election security, the work that we're doing that is more directly related to ensuring that elections reflect the will of the voters, let's say, is going to be part of part two. So in part two, we are more directly reviewing county policies and procedures and practices that are meant to prevent things like tampering with the tabulation of the votes, tampering with the machines that are being used, things like that. I think that work will more directly address the concern that you are talking about. But in neither case, this or part two, will we be able to definitively say whether fraud is occurring.
Continue, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know that we had the opportunity to visit the Shawnee election office, and several of us also toured Johnson County, and they appeared to be in sync for the size of the area that they were covering. Many things were alike, a couple of things were different, but you would expect it on population, is kind of what we saw. On the view, from the viewpoint of your volunteers, was it positive in the amount of training that they had received? And I know you said a couple had not had any training at all, but overall, their response, did they feel like they were satisfactorily trained? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
So we didn't survey workers. We only surveyed the top-level county election officers. And as you see on page 9, if speaking simply in terms of whether they felt prepared to oversee elections, you'll see that overall, actually the top line of figure 2 on page 9 is a good encapsulation of what you're asking, if you don't mind talking about officers instead of workers. They said that 96% of respondents said that they felt extremely or very prepared to administer and oversee elections. Does that get at the spirit of what you're asking? Okay.
Are there any other questions? Mr. Vice Chairman.
On page 16 of your testimony or of the report, it's really interesting that like Colorado, Florida, and Maryland made ballot images public while Missouri, Utah, and apparently Kansas don't. I mean, that's a pretty, total different direction. What is the basic argument on that? I mean, I believe there was like a lawsuit in Kansas, wasn't there, a couple of years ago on trying to make ballot images public or something back in the 2014 election. Somebody was trying to do some analysis or something like that. But, I mean, are you aware of, what's the logic one way or the other on that?
So I can't speak to a 2014 lawsuit. The Secretary of State's office would probably be better placed to speak to that. In terms of what we heard when we talked to people like Secretary of State's office, county officials in Colorado, the biggest pro is transparency. So people can see the actual ballots that were tabulated to determine the election results, and they can then know sort of what went into that tabulation and whether, I guess, they agree with how the count was done, or how it turned out.
Is it available online? Like you can actually, like here's all the ballots cast in Shawnee County and you can just scroll through it and see every ballot? Is that how that would be in?
In Colorado, that is the case. All but one county, so San Juan County is the only county in Colorado that hand counts paper ballots. So they're not reflected in the database. It's a very small mountain county. All the rest of them are in the database and anyone can query it. Maryland, a selection of them are available to be queried in their database. They're not all in the database. They choose the ones that are like the most uncertain to show like what the tabulator saw, how it counted it, and then it shows the public how it, how it turned out. In both states, though, anyone can request the ballots that are not on those databases. But most of them are easily accessible through the internet. Now, one of the cons that Colorado told us about is that it took a lot of money to get that database stood up. And so it was a big technological lift and very expensive lift for them, but they did it, obviously, primarily to increase transparency and public trust.
Representative Neighbor.
For a second time, I'm sorry. Okay, when you talk about being able to see the ballot, does that have the voter's name on it? Because privacy is always a consideration in how people vote, because there are individuals out there that say, I know who you voted for and how you did it. And so far, that's not been true. I mean, we know if a person has voted, you can find that out easily, but you don't know who they voted for on their ballot. And so I want to make sure that that kind of information remains private to the voter and they feel secure in how we do that. Because it kind of sounded like people had their name and that was available for people to find out. And I just want to make sure that's not what we're hearing.
No, so there's no identifying, there's no name on a ballot, whether that's here or in Colorado or Maryland or the places where you can just look up someone's ballot. There's no name on the ballot. So from that perspective, no one should be able to tell whose it is. It's also not legal to put unique identifying marks on a ballot. So theoretically, someone could put some special mark on their ballot. And then if that weren't redacted before it went into the database, they could find it and they would be able to show themselves or someone else how they voted because the mark is there. But that's not legal. And it would be possible, from my understanding, it would be possible to redact marks like that before they are put on the database. But of course, that's another hurdle technologically. But you were right to say that people's expectation, as we were told by the Secretary of State's office, is that their ballots are secret permanently, that no one will see their ballot, even if it can't be tied back to them. And so that is a concern that people have raised with regard to putting images of the ballots or the cast vote records online or making them otherwise publicly available.
Representative Howell.
Thank you, Chair. This is not really a question, and if it's not appropriate, just cut me off. It's okay. Just kind of further on the general topic of posting ballots publicly. I know one thing, that if we were to consider such a thing in Kansas, one of the things we would need to consider is there is such a thing as we do have precincts that are so small, like you're talking less than 10 voters in a precinct. So if you could see the precinct on the ballot and have a voter registration list and compare the two, it would take, in my very limited experience of the ballot images being dumped on the internet or posted somewhere, you're talking, thousands and thousands of ballots. You would really have to be dedicated to spending this time, but there are people. But you could sit there, we all know them. They could sit there and kind of figure out, okay, there's 10 ballots for this precinct, there's 10 registered voters, there's X number of Republicans, there's X number, and they could highly likely figure out who's who. So there would be definitely need to be some real safety, privacy issues that we would need to be careful of if we were to consider such a thing. On the other hand, and as a general rule, I'm very for government transparency, but the privacy of the actual vote of the voter is very important. And so this would be something to have in mind if we ever went down that route.
Depending on the precinct, it might be readily apparent just by looking at the ballot what precinct it was from. So, yeah. Representative Berquist, you have a question?
Yeah, and years ago, I experienced that by, it's kind of like, oh, didn't mean to see that because there was that few people in the precinct and they were all one party, and it showed what the vote was. So it showed what they likely did, unless there was some mistake. So yeah, the smaller the precinct, the more likely it is you're going to surmise, but you're not going to know absolutely sure. But.
Are there any other questions for Mr. Brenzo? So I've got a couple, if it's okay. So what are the consequences right now if an elections officer, clerk, or commissioner doesn't do the training? Is there any consequence at all for that person?
No.
Okay. And then you mentioned that some folks seek training elsewhere besides the Secretary of State's office. What are the other sources they can go to for elections training?
So we have this on page 9, but so we had 76 respondents, 20 of them, this is the survey of county election officers. 20 of them said that they got regular training from sources that were not the Secretary of State's office. And examples that they gave us were like officials, associations, voting machine vendors actually provided training. And they also had positive things to say in general about the relevance and effectiveness of these other training sources.
All right, thank you very much. Last call for questions. Okay, seeing none, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
So I'm gonna drive my committee assistant nuts by changing the order of conferees to make the minutes harder to write. I'm gonna ask Ms. Jennifer Cook, the Assistant Secretary of State, to come up.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Jennifer Cook, Assistant Secretary of State. Mr. Chairman, we appreciate the opportunity to, is that better? There we go. We appreciate the opportunity to work with LPA on this audit to highlight the importance of training in election administration. This is something we feel very strongly about in the Secretary of State's office, and as the committee knows and as they've heard from LPA today, the election system in Kansas is very decentralized, and I think that's some of the reason why you don't see a lot of requirements around training and statute, because there's a recognition of the differences, different roles between the Secretary of State's office, which as a chief election officer, we don't directly administer elections in Kansas, but our role is to provide the guidance, resources, and training for our county election officials and our county election commissioners. And so as a practical matter, we do things like accepting filings for national and state offices. We instruct counties on changes in law. We help provide policy clarifications, and we oversee our statewide voter registration system. But it's also important to note what we don't do. We don't provide legal guidance or advice to the counties, and we don't have an enforcement role over the counties. You know, the county election officials handle the nuts and bolts of election administration. So, you know, they handle the printing of ballots, the programming of voting equipment, obtaining of polling locations, hiring those election board workers, and all of those day-to-day administrative things. And we don't have a role in enforcement there or dictating to them how they structure that. And so while we agree that it's very important that counties receive annual training and training beyond that, which I'll go into in a minute, and Brian Caskey can also touch on that a little bit. One of the reasons we raised a concern about the LPA's recommendation is that there is no authority for us to require counties to obtain training. We are required to provide it. We provide it annually, as Andy noted, at the KCCOA annual meeting. But if a county doesn't attend that in-person training, we also work with them one-on-one to make sure that they receive those training materials. Brian or other staff will review that with them. So they do receive that training. We can provide that assurance. It may not be in person. It may be in a more one-on-one setting, but it is important to us, and we do recognize that, and there is a way for us to help the counties achieve that. We also provide other training throughout the year beyond what is required in statute. And this includes things like cybersecurity training, which is becoming more and more of a focus, Elvis training, which is training on how to properly use the statewide voter registration system. We provide training on weekly conference calls that we hold with our county election officials. And then we also have flexibility to provide other training on specific topics as the need arises. And then to touch on one of the questions that came up a little bit earlier, an initiative that we started about this time last year is the development and implementation of a county election certification program. We are very excited about this. We're going to launch it later this spring, actually, with our first training. And what this will do, and Brian can touch on this a little more as well, but this will provide in-depth training to our county election officials. Over a multi-year period, we're actually going to pilot it starting this spring, and we'll fast track that program. But it will go in depth in everything from how to run an election, to how to manage your office, to cybersecurity. And so we're very excited. We think this will be a great benefit to both our longtime county election officials, and we've had a number of new county election officials be elected to office in the past few years, and so we think that will be very beneficial to them as well. So we're looking forward to launching that program later this spring. Mr. Chairman, be happy to stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Committee, if it's okay, I'm going to have all the Secretary of State folks come up, and then we'll ask questions, and they can kind of punt it between them if they like. Our next conferee is Mr. Clay Barker with Secretary of State's office. Welcome back to the committee.
Mr. Chair, I'm going to limit my comments only to the issue of the cast vote records and ballot images, and Mr. Caskey has the meat of the training, and then, of course, we have the real on-the-ground experts after that. Right now, Kansas has a criminal law that states it's a felony for an election official to release the contents of any ballot, which is broader language than most states. Most states just say the ballot. And the lawsuit that was mentioned was Clarkson versus Lehman, where there was a request in Sedgwick County for something similar to a cast vote record. It wasn't exactly the same. The court denied that. But in the case, it discussed the theory, and it didn't make a decision on this, that ballot and ballot-like stuff are outside the Open Records Act because the legislature has created cradle-to-grave legislation, how you create them, how you store them, who can get them, and mandatory destruction after 22 months. Based on that, most counties did not turn over the ballots. They were too afraid of creating a felony. Then last year, the legislature enacted a new statute that said it's forbidden to release information from which you can associate a voter with the contents of a ballot, and ordered our office to create regulations, which we did. Brian and I did a 360 analysis and determined the only gaps were to make it clear that the cast vote record and ballot images cannot be released, because it is possible in some of the ways we're discussed here to find out how some of the voters voted from those records if you know what you're doing. And that got through JCAR, unsinged in my part, and that's a pretty tough committee. And the Attorney General had 2 lawyers look at it and say, yes, this is consistent with the statute. So those regulations are coming out. They have not been imposed yet. And that's where Kansas stands on this. Kansas has taken a very strong secrecy position, and as pointed out, other states have taken a less secrecy, more transparency position. That's the legislature's policy decision there.
Thank you. And our last conferee is Mr. Brian Caskey, also from the Secretary of State's office. Welcome back to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm going to touch a little bit more on training, and then I want to follow up a little bit on the nursing home aspect of this as well. The post-election audit focused a lot on the May annual training because that's the most visible, it's the biggest one. And I want to touch a little bit on why we think, and another reason why we don't particularly want to take attendance is because they're going to get trained. But many of these counties in western Kansas only have 1 or 2 or 3 people in the election office, i.e. the county clerk's office. In all of those counties, the county clerk is the chief election official, and they have 2 people. And so if one person's gone, the other person can't travel. If they have an election, they can't travel. If they have a personal issue, they can't travel. If they have a county commission meeting that's really important, they can't travel. And so all of those I have experienced in my tenure of administering this training, and I personally don't feel it's good to penalize someone from not physically being there because logistically they just don't have enough people. But I can assure you that every single one of those counties is getting training from our office every year. And I also want to focus on all the other things that we do. Most of my job is teaching and training. I use those words synonymously. I consider myself a teacher, hopefully a good one. But it's not just May that we talk to them. The County Clerk Association is split up into 6 regions. Those regions meet twice a year. I personally go to at least 2/3 of those meetings every single year to conduct training sessions. In addition to that, one of the things that came up is the county clerks receive training from someone other than the Secretary of State's office. One of the things they do is they have their own certification program to be a county clerk. Part of that is elections, and most years I teach classes in that association, in their association. In fact, next week I'm teaching 2 classes, one for new clerks and one for experienced clerks. So we are almost always part of that agenda also. I do weekly calls pretty much from the 1st of May through the end of December every single week for every one of the 105 counties. We've already had probably 4 calls this year in the spring, mostly to talk about legislation and other stuff. But every single week, every county has personal access to me and can ask me anything. On those meetings, we will talk about what's next on the election calendar, what legislative changes are in front of us, any hot topics that are going on. And so I consider that a key part of this is that we are always available so that all of them can hear the same information at the same time. And then kind of separate from this, Jennifer touched on this, our statewide voter registration system. We offer mandatory training for every county. Every new employee that uses the system has to go through that training. So that's a completely separate thing that we do. We offer security training every year that takes different forms and shapes. Some years we've used the Fusion Center and the Kansas National Guard. Some years we've used DHS. Sometimes it's been us. That's constantly evolving, so we use several different sources to do security training. And then lastly, almost every day, I would say every day that I'm in the office, I'm talking to county election officials, and they're calling to ask questions. And so every day we are touching them to teach them, to train them, and to put them in the best possible position for them to succeed. They're the ones doing the work. They're elected in their own right, except for the Big Four. And so I think that we try as hard as we can to put them in the best possible position from a training standpoint. Separately, I want to talk just a little bit about nursing home voting. I think one of the difficulties, sorry to speak for you, Andy, I apologize, but I think one of the difficulties they may have faced is that 2020 was in the middle of the pandemic. And so election officials could not get into nursing home facilities to personally assist voters. Almost, as far as I know, just about every assisted care facility was locked down. We have in our laws the mobile poll law, and pre-pandemic, several counties took advantage of that, where they would appoint an election board, like you see on election day, and that board would go to the nursing home facility and allow them to vote in person for anyone in that facility that wanted to. That happens as an arrangement between the election office and the nursing home. Right now, it's optional. It's been optional for about 10 years. Pre-pandemic, it was widely used. Post-pandemic, it has not been. I'm hopeful that in '24 that we see more of that. But I think that's a great program that sworn election board workers will go in person to the election and to the nursing home facilities and assisted living and conduct the election there. They're usually open, 1 to 2 hours, and they can do that. So I'm a huge proponent of that. Unfortunately, that really was not used in 2020. So with that, we would like Andrew Howell to speak also. So if you want to ask us questions now or after Andrew, whatever.
Yep. I think we'll pause here for any questions for the Secretary of State's office. Representative Bergquist.
Yes, sir. To any of you, coming from municipalities for a number of years, I can see your training as being something that have you considered doing a module training to give to the League of Municipalities or the Association of Counties to go to the elected officials for them to understand on an abbreviated fashion to understand the election process, because they get bombarded with questions and they say, I don't know what goes on. And when the county clerks or the city clerks in some cases are very acquainted with elections, the elected folks are brand new, and that could be another thing that they could gain from to understand the election process.
It's a great question, thank you. I personally have given trainings to the League of Municipalities, the City Clerk School. I've done that several years. Clay just recently made a presentation to the school district clerks. Our office over the years has done intermittent training with county commissioners to talk about their duties as county board of canvassers. I know that Clay has given presentations to the county attorneys. And so a lot of those groups we have done. So I would say it's not every year, but it has definitely happened. All of those have happened under Secretary of State Schwab at least once.
Very cool. Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Howell.
Thank you, Chair. Since I have already in the past displayed interest, I would like a more detailed report, I guess, on where is the election officials training status and what is the first wave going to look like, and just kind of just more information.
Absolutely. I have a two-page overview that we can provide to the committee, and if I could bear your indulgence, I can talk a little bit more if you want me to. So we, after last legislative session, I think it was in April, actually, we hired Connie Schmidt, former Johnson County Election Commissioner, to head up this program. So she has been working on the curriculum and the framework for this, and the first class is going to be taught at the May class, in the May county clerk meeting in May. That will be the first class. It's going to be a 3-year program. We are recommending that every county have at least one person go through that program. There will be 3 sessions every year. Each session will be about 3 hours, so we're looking about close to 30 hours total training. Connie has done this type of training in the states of Ohio, Virginia, and Minnesota, so she is a nationwide expert on this type of program. Of course, we'll have Kansas-specific information on others, but, you know, she's a leading expert in this, and so that's where we're going. Jennifer touched on the topics. I've got a draft of those that I can share with the committee as well. And so if you have any more information, I'm happy to share it, but that's kind of where we are.
Representative Howe.
Just kind of a follow-up with that. Does the Secretary of State office have any intention of making this type of training like available by like a videotape type setup so that it could be watched and taken by election commissioners or county clerks that, you know, aren't able to travel? As you mentioned, I know that is a serious issue. They basically have no life, actually, besides elections. That's just reality. We think we have it hard in the legislature. It's nothing compared to what the election officials go through. So I was just curious, is that something that's on the table or discussion or in the plans, and also for the actual election workers, for general training for election workers throughout the counties?
Great question. Yes, it's in the plan. So the kickoff training everyone's going to get will be in May in person. After that, when we start teaching year 1, the 3 classes, we're going to look at a variety of delivery methods. We're going to go regional, meaning we're going to meet the clerks where they physically are, because I still think physical in-person training is still very valuable. We're going to look at Zoom. We're going to look at taping it. Basically, all the options are on the table for the very reasons that you've said. So I can't tell you today, time, and place, but all that's on the table. As far as training election board workers, we still rely on the county election officers. They still do that. We provide information to them, but it's still, we are not conducting that training. We're just helping as we can.
I got a question. So, and this may be for Mr. Barker, I'm not sure. But so after an election, you guys up in the auditorium up there or someplace up there, you guys do a kind of pulling precincts out of a hat for, is it for each House district that you do that, or each county, or how do you?
So I assume this is about the post-election audit?
Yeah.
So what the post-election requires is 1 federal race, 1 statewide race in a statewide year, 1 legislative race, and then 1 county race. And so for each county, we are pulling the names of each of those types of districts for each of the 105 counties.
Okay, so it's not an individual precinct, it's a specific race.
So the Secretary of State's office picks the race. We tell the counties that day, this is the race. Then they have the same thing happen in the county. It has to be in public, advertised, and then they will draw the precincts out of the hat that belong to that particular race. So the counties actually draw the precinct with the same process right after, the next day after we draw the races.
So when they do the recount for that precinct, are they using the paper ballots, or are they using the ballot images if they have ballot images?
Yes, both.
Okay, so they are always doing the physical ballot and the ballot images?
The county makes a decision on if they are counting the pieces of paper or if they're also using ballot images.
Okay, and so I want to make sure I understood what you said. So there's going to be 1 legislative race and then the statewide races. So if you're the county that has that legislative race, you're going to be doing a recount of 1 precinct in that race?
So this isn't, we're talking about the audit, not the recount.
Yeah.
And so it's 10%, it's 1% of the precincts in that race. So every county has a legislative race. So every county is going to draw at least 1 precinct in the legislative race that we tell them.
Okay, but it's up to them whether they count the paper ballot or the ballot image. That's not mandated in statute or anything.
It is not mandated in statute. It is my belief that most all of them count the paper ballot. The reason why the ballot image is used is specifically in the larger counties. we are only pulling, a handful of precincts. When you're in the large counties and you have 50,000 pieces of paper, the biggest time frame is finding the right precincts to pull out. If you can look at the ballot image, you can do that exponentially faster than flipping through 50,000 ballots to get the 500 that you're going to audit. So that's the primary purpose for using the ballot image, is to help sorting. Then normally it's the paper that's actually counted.
Thank you for indulging me. The question came up at the beginning of the year, and I finally had you in a spot where we were talking ballot images, so thank you. Are there any other questions for the Secretary of State's office? Mr. Vice Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know if Clay Barker or the Deputy Secretary of State, but there was a comment made that the Secretary of State's office does not have enforcement powers on training. Is that sort of a general truth that everything is decentralized? You guys can't enforce anything as far as on training? I think it's where the context
The
was.
auditors kind of hit on the point that the Kansas laws are somewhat vague, but Kansas has adopted a bottom-up election system. It's the statutes, and the counties follow them and conduct the election and work with the voters. And the Secretary of State, if you want to think of a line in block diagram, is a dotted line going to the counties. Statute gives us certain duties, and we've come up with the ballot rotation, approved mail ballot plans, must give training, but we don't have a lot of stick or carrot, actually. I think Mr. Caskey's diplomacy and expertise is what holds a lot of it together so well. Now, some states like Colorado are a top-down system. They have 60 people in their Secretary of State Elections Department. We have 5, and 2 of those don't do elections full-time, and we have a vacancy at the moment. It's just a different style of how you organize your elections. So,
I recall in the bill that we just passed, kind of the mega Secretary of State bill, the opening paragraph was about the Secretary of State was getting some sort of general authority over the elections. Does that change any of this?
I think that just restates more clearly the current setup. Part of the reason for that section was some county commissioners were trying to edge in on the county elections officer, saying, we're going to tell you how to run your election, when the actual process is the county commissioners approve the budget, county election officer runs the elections, and the county commissioners, as the canvas, can then verify whatever they want. And that was just to clarify that, and that the role of the 2 organizations, county election officers and Secretary of State.
I'd like to move along unless there's somebody who just isn't going to be able to sleep this weekend if they don't ask Secretary of State's office something. So, okay. I'm gonna make it difficult on our committee assistant again by changing the order up here, and I'd like to have Mr. Andrew Howe come up first, since he can specifically speak to the bigger counties, and then we'll have Mr. Pifo after him talk more about the counties that are smaller. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Andrew Howell, Shawnee County Election Commissioner. Committee, I guess I'm trying to think of exactly what to cover. And so I think probably the first thing I'll talk about just for a minute from hearing your conversation today is about training considerations for us in Shawnee County. Keep in mind that budget issues always drive our ability to do some of this. And I think like we just heard, quite frankly, when county commissioners are setting budgets, and we're trying to make them work, you're going to see a little bit of variation in how that's done, but that's certainly a consideration for us. The other thing that's a little different for us, actually the county here has passed a resolution back in 2008 requiring that we accomplish 2 hours of training for every election worker. So we actually have local rules that also additionally kind of inform how we do it here. Just to give you a little better picture on that, I actually do a 1-hour class for all election workers on election law and processes, and then I break it up and have either me or someone in the office do a poll book and check-in processes, about an hour class on that, and then another hour on startup and shutdown of machines and kind of starting and stopping the process. Additionally, I have a special training class for judges, and then we also have something we call Practice Makes Perfect, which allows election workers to come get their hands on and spend a little bit more time kind of walking through the machines and the poll books if they've got additional time that they want to use. So that's how we've organized it. We have about 800 election workers in a major election, 94 poll places, so it takes a little bit to stay on top of that. If you think about it, you get about 2 weeks out from Election Day, and we have as many as 100 either new workers or drops. So trying to stay on top of the administration of who's going to which class and which of the 94 locations they're going to get assigned to, and then additionally making sure that they are properly party designated, because we want at least 2 people of different parties. That gets to be fairly time-consuming and complex staying on top of that. So I guess just a reminder of the complexity of some of that. Additionally, we also we try to watch experience balance as well. I want people at every location that have at least a number of years. I found that in the past, when we got into issues at a polling place, it really related to the years of experience on the board. So we really spend a lot of time watching and making sure I've got a judge that's at least got 4 or 5 years and at least a worker or 2 with a number of years. So just, I guess, things that we think about and try to pay attention to. The other thing we spend quite a bit of time doing, and again, I feel sorry for clerks sometimes who really have to do all the other things in addition to what we do, because they've clearly got their hands full. We spend quite a bit of time doing process improvement, trying to make sure that our processes follow the law or improve to the extent that we can. And I would add that, I think Brian mentioned this, that really the pandemic was very difficult in that we had to make a lot of decisions very quickly. Quite frankly, I had to put up about 20 sheets of plastic in our early voting, and I was standing on top of desks doing it myself because there just wasn't time to do that. So some of those things you just really have to engage quickly and make big decisions and keep it moving. And additionally, it's complex when you have staff changes, because it really takes about 4 years to truly train somebody to run all the different types of elections. Each year's got a different type of election, and it changes a lot. So that can be complex. Additionally, we have to follow county rules and procedures and policies. So staying on top of those, staying on top of exactly how do we pay our workers, those processes take a lot of staff time and are complex. And additionally, I would add that intermittent staffing, we have about 25 people, I would say, and we're fortunate that many people from the legislature are actually willing to come help us for 4 to 5 months out of every year. So we've kind of found a group of people that we think are very smart, very capable, and willing to help us year after year. So that helps a lot, but that's tough, I think, for a lot of locations to find good people. You really can only use them for 4 or 5 months out of a year at most, but they really have to know what they're doing, because it's very complex and it's civil rights that are at stake if you mess it up. So that's always a challenge, to find good people to help you during the 4 or 5 months that there's a lot to do relating to mail ballots and prepping election equipment and dealing with all of those challenges. Let's see. We have some people in our office that have actually worked for us almost 30 years as intermittents that just come back year after year, and those people are invaluable. A number of those actually that are still helping us to this day. The other thing I might mention, election training documents, we work on those a lot, trying to make sure that they're accurate, that they get the point across of training. But there are 600 statutes in election, actually in excess of that. And so trying to get across in an hour, it's always a challenge to talk about all the important things and the not so important things and not overwhelm people. So that's always, I think, a constant challenge. And I think comparing Kansas to other states is difficult. It just is, because I think it's a little bit different system here. Every county does it just a little bit differently. So I found that interesting comparing to other states. But I actually talked to one of the developers that did the development work, and it was very expensive and very time consuming to try to post all of your ballot images online. And I think kind of your comment, Representative Howell, about being careful about those precincts, I think by law that are 20 or less, that you're required not to expose somebody's intention can be an issue. Additionally, one of the things I worry about is if somebody actually puts a write-in, an unusual write-in, you can actually identify yourself to other people just with unusual write-ins in certain races. So there's kind of some other complexities that probably ought to be thought about carefully. You know, in 2016, I'll talk for just a second about mobile polling. In 2016, we actually had to cut mobile polling out, even though I didn't want to, just because our budget was cut pretty severely that year. And that makes it difficult. We used to try to do it. In fact, we did. I actually brought it back, I think, in 2018 or 2019. But 2020, we simply couldn't get into the facilities to do mobile polling because of COVID, and it's been tough, actually, to get back in. One of the things that we used to try to do was have our polling places be in those locations to make it easier for people who live there to get to the polling place. But that's been tough. We've had a few that still let us do that, but we've got some that just won't let us back in. So we're going to continue to try to do some mobile polling, but it's been a challenge since 2020 just because of the policies of a lot of those locations. Additionally, they like to have locked doors on their facilities a lot of times, depending on who they have and kind of how they've set their operation up. So that's made it difficult to get voters in past a locked door. There's some security issues that's made that kind of tricky as well. So I guess those are my initial comments. Also, I find a lot of folks are already on the permanent, they've already requested a permanent ballot. So a number of the people that you're going to talk to may already be on a permanent list. So it takes a little bit of coordination with those facilities to figure out who's already on perm, who wants to vote at the mobile polling site versus having a perm ballot sent to them. So there's some complexities with that. I like the concept, and we used to do it pretty consistently, but just really haven't been able to get off the ground since 2020 with that. So other than that, I think that's just listening to the conversation. Those are the comments that I would like to make.
Okay. Are there any questions for Mr. Howe? Representative Berquist.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, sir. Remind us, out of 105 counties, why the 4 large counties election officers are appointed by the Secretary of State's office?
There is I believe it's 130,000 population requirement that once you hit that threshold, those appointments are made by the Secretary of State. As a practical matter, I would find it a little bit difficult to focus on all the things that we're doing and to have to run an election. Could it be done? Of course it could. But I think that may be a part of just consideration. It is a full-time job. It becomes your life whether you want it to or not, and staying on top of the details is a challenge.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Mr. Howe? Representative Howe.
Thank you, Chair. Just for curiosity, do you mind telling us how many elections you have currently in the queue of all kinds right now?
Well, we know that there is a chance that we are going to have a primary. Of course, we won't know till we see who's filed. I won't know the answer to this year's city and school district primary until June the 1st. But if we have more than 4 people in any race, that will call for a primary. So we know that we have 2. We think there's a remote chance of another mail ballot potentially that could occur. So I could say there's at least 3 that I'm aware of are a possibility. Some years I think we've had 4, 5, or 6. I don't know that we typically have as many here as, say, Sedgwick or Johnson County. But that's my understanding at the moment.
All right. So when Mr. Brenzo was testifying, he had a picture in the audit of an overvoted ballot, and he said something. I wanted to ask your perspective on it. Do you guys, if there's a ballot and the machine counts it as an overvote, do you go look at that ballot to determine voter intent as a matter of normal operation?
I think there are some ballots that, yes, and I guess the thing we ought to also say here, you know, I personally and our full-time staff don't make those actual determinations. I think we should be careful in communicating with the public to remind everybody that I don't make those decisions. Our staff doesn't make them. We set the parameters, we set the rules, and we make sure the teams of Republican and Democrat appointees do that. So, and that happens for the advanced mail ballot board. It happens for the advanced early board. Happens for hand tallies, for write-ins, for the audit board, for the recount board, for the canvass board, and the election day poll workers. So I guess to answer your question, yes, there are situations where we'll need to do that. It doesn't happen often, but it does happen.
So, but mechanically, if, you know, so you run the ballots through the count machine, and the machine says that, you know, this X ballot is an overvote, how do you dig that ballot out and look at it and see if, you know, try to determine voter intent? That's what I didn't understand out of that. What's kind of the mechanical process?
Well, for most of the ballots that get run in, those are pretty well determined. You're not going to be digging back through and trying to figure out which one it is. If it ran through, you got to remember though too, most, at least the machines that we have are set up to kick the ballot back and to warn a voter, hey, we're showing that there's a question mark as to how this particular one is filled out. Do you want to revote or do what's called a void spoiled ballot and just void the old one, do a new one, and don't have an overvote issue? So if the machines are set up correctly, that really should be handled on the front side.
And I'm really asking this question for all the people who are going to watch this later, because, you know, this voter confidence thing is, you know, so if that voter puts that ballot in the machine and the machine tells them, hey, you overvoted the governor of whatever state that ballot was, and they say, no, I don't want to revote, count it, that's it, right? They're not going to get another, nobody's going to take that ballot out and try to look at the hanging chads and decide, okay, I just wanted to make sure we had that on the record. So, okay, any other questions? All right, thank you very much. Appreciate you being here today. Our final conferee is Mr. Rick Pifo. Welcome back to the committee.
Thank you. Just to introduce myself, if we haven't met before, I'm Rick Pifo. I'm the Harvey County Clerk and Chair of the Elections Committee for the Kansas County Clerks and Election Officials Association. I am also one of the counties that was selected for the more in-depth audit. So I'm very familiar with this audit personally. We don't generally have any issues with the data that was collected in the audit. One issue I think that maybe should be noted is that they didn't collect data on who paid for this stuff. You know, if Colorado mandates training, are they paying for it? Or like to Florida, if they're gonna incentivize training, that's awesome, you know. So that would be one issue, is the funding component. It also didn't really check, like Clay mentioned, some states are top down, some are bottom up. Some states require every county to use the exact same election equipment. So therefore, it would be easier to provide training materials, especially operational type training materials from a state level, if all the equipment was the same. That's not the case in Kansas. So at least operational training has to be provided by our vendors or by us locally as to how we operate elections. And that's mostly what poll workers need, is they need more operational. How do I check a voter in? You know, supervising judges need a little more of the background, statutes, stuff like that, but poll workers mostly need the operational. How do I make this machine work? You know, so that's the main focus of our training, especially when, for me, we just got new equipment in the past year, so that changed the focus of that training. And our training that we get annually from the Secretary of State's office is often focused on legislation, because you guys keep changing the laws, and we got to figure out how to implement that. As I mentioned, for 101 of us, elections are not our only job. You know, we have a lot of other duties. We do tax roll, we do R&R statements. A lot of these duties overlap with elections. R&R statements are due to go out around August 1st. Guess what? We normally do a primary in early August. Tax roll is due to the treasurer November 1st. Guess what? We do an election first part of November. So we have a lot of other duties, and most of us don't have the resources that like Andrew and the big counties have that can devote the time to looking through all these materials, and you know, and we focus on making sure we get the job done. And you know, that whatever the laws are you give us, we're going to focus on getting the job done. If that means, you know, going through our resources such as state statutes. I guess it's important to point out that our jobs, there's not a private sector equivalent. So you're not going to just grab a person out of private business that, oh, you know how to run elections. And even if there was a certification program, it's not likely that people that are not in the business are going to get certified and be ready to jump into the job. So one of the issues with requiring training is I'm elected just like you guys are. So what would be the consequences if required training wasn't performed? Does it invalidate the election? Does it kick me out of my office? And very few elected offices actually have a requirement, other than sheriff has to get trained within a year. And a lot of clerks have a lot of turnover of clerks. So what happens if a new clerk comes in October, has to run an election in November? Right now it happens. I mean, we have a deadline. Election day is our deadline. We have to make it happen. So, and we have a long history of making it happen regardless of what our training is. Like I said, we have a Bible, we have the statutes to go by. We have resources such as Secretary of State's office with our calls and their training. If you have a question, you call Brian or the office. We have a robust system of communication amongst the clerks. We support each other. If a question comes up about something, an email will go out on our listserv. You'll get a bunch of answers back. So like I said, I'm a huge advocate of training. And I personally am one of the ones that have taken, there's a national certification program that you have to take 12 classes to get a CIRA certification from the Election Center. But those classes, and I've taken all my classes, I don't actually have my certificate yet, but those classes are $400 to $500 per day and a half class, plus the timing and travel, and so it's expensive to do, but like I said, anytime there's training available, I'm all for it. And we're trying as an association to develop some more mentorship and training programs. But like I said, huge props to all of the election officers out there for getting the elections done every time, putting you and I in office. You guys just had an election that have you sitting here, conducted by my colleagues, me and my colleagues. So, one I wanted to touch on a little bit. They already talked on the integrity of the anonymous ballot. The long-term care facilities, I think that's, leave it up to the local officials to determine the best plan. In my county, I work closely with all of the long-term care facilities that they help with voter registration. When new residents come in, they get them registered. If they want to sign up for permanent advance, so they get it by mail. We don't do mobile polling because most of our long-term do vote by mail. And I've had talks with the social workers. They do have their own associations. They have their own ethics that when it was brought up that maybe some facilities workers were getting extra votes. The main one I talked to was like, she got all fired up and was going to go back to her association and make sure that that's not happening. And so that'd be my 2 cents on that. But I'd be happy to stand for questions.
Are there any questions for Mr. Pifo? Yeah, it's 10 till.
Yeah.
The questions just dry right up. I have questions. I apologize, committee, but I'll get us out of here in time, I'm pretty sure. So what's your sense when the member clerks and member counties in your association are doing audits? What's your sense of how many of them are using paper ballots to do the count versus ballot images? Would you have any estimate on that at all?
I'm not sure. I haven't polled them. It is a lot faster to use the images because of the sorting issue. We can actually sort it down to the precinct. So once we've done our draw and everything and it comes time for the board to do the audit, we can, on the system, I have a huge TV bigger than that they look at, and it just sorts all of the ballots down to that particular precinct and that particular race. So they're just seeing that one race on each ballot, and they can go through and say Bob, Sue, Bob, whatever, you know, and they're hand tallying that based on those, from those images. But it's a lot faster than trying to sort through the
And
ballot.
as a follow-up, I don't have the bill number in front of me, but there was a bill that was introduced in this committee, I believe it was introduced to the committee, it may have been introduced, you filed and assigned the committee, that would have required counties to use paper ballots when they do that count. Does your association have any opinion on that? I know I'm putting you on the spot.
I mean, I appreciate, well, when the audit regs were first written, we participated in that. And one of the things we kind of pushed for was the ability to use facsimile images, which would be the image of the ballot instead of the actual ballot. So we would be in favor of still having that ability to do that. Like I said, it's a time thing. Once again, a lot of things come down to budget. You pay me a bunch of money and, you know, to hire poll workers, then it makes it a lot more feasible. But you also have a timing issue, because if it takes more time, then it's holding up the results.
The concern I have heard from constituents is, well, what if a ballot didn't get counted or scanned by the machine, but it's in the box, you know, that's a vote that wasn't counted.
Well, we make everything balanced. We know how many people checked in, we know how many ballots we have, so, I mean.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. And then my last question, I promised committee. I was a little shocked to hear, I guess this is really more of a, please talk to your membership about this, but I was a little shocked to hear that some long-term care facilities here in Shawnee County from the previous conferee won't let poll workers come in and do a remote polling place. I would like to know kind of what your association thinks about requiring long-term care facilities to do that, because to me, that's disenfranchising those voters. If they don't get a mail-in ballot and we're not availing them of the opportunity, there's the potential that they get disenfranchised.
I mean, I think we would agree that it's a good idea to have that ability to set up a mobile polling. So if there's something in the nursing homes that doesn't allow them to do that, I mean, I guess I could understand in some units where they're locked down or something that maybe you wouldn't be allowed, but I don't know why otherwise it wouldn't at least be allowed. Like I said, in my county, it doesn't work really well because we'd be expending a lot of resources for very few extra votes, I guess.
All right. Last call for questions. Representative Neighbor.
I think one of the things that we've heard today that I think we also heard when we visited the Shawnee election office and stuff, when we talk about numbers, those numbers that we saw that were counted and recounted all had to come out with the same number. So if it was 691 here, it had to be 691 there. And I think that in itself is that checkpoint or that check system that says the paper count was the same as the ballot count. And I think we, at some point, we need to educate the people that we serve that as we have visited and seen these things, we either say you need to go out and learn about it, or there is a system in place where X equals Y. And that is a secure lock system that we've seen or heard of, I believe, everywhere across the state, because that safety measure has to be in place, or we couldn't be confident about what we're doing or what they're doing. And I think we have to give them support in that they have that checks and balances system. And it's like when I spoke before. We had a person in our community who said, I know how you voted and all of this kind of stuff. That was not true. And he called and threatened voters. That's not right. And we need to tell people and assure them that their vote is private and their vote is counted. And I think that's as much our job after seeing and listening to all of this as it is, we need to work together to communicate that to the general public.
So here's a great opportunity to get it on the record on YouTube for all eternity. What is the method by which you make sure the number of physical ballots that are in that box equal the number of ballots that were counted by the counting machine?
Simplistically, you have your poll books, and you have a count on the poll books. You know how many people checked in. 500 people checked in. We have a count on the ballot scanner. 500 ballots were scanned. You know, if the numbers start differing from that, then we have to research it further and see why is there, or is there an explanation for, you know, somebody brought in their advanced ballot and just dropped it in the can, or, you know, something like that. But there's ways to, we have checks and balances, ways to determine if there was a fraudulent ballot in there. So, I mean.
Now it's on YouTube for all eternity. Thank you, Mr. Pifo.
Thank you. And I think one of the things they said too when they were counting them, Mr. Chairman, that if something was not marked correctly or was unsatisfactory at that point, it came out. But they stacked them in groups of 20 or 25 or 50, whatever it is, and they'd pull it out and then they'd go back and make sure there was 25 in every stack. And then they could go back and look at that ballot and get it rectified if it needed to be. So I think that's another checks and balance.
Thank you, Representative. Any other questions for Mr. Pifo? Okay, at 5 o'clock, nobody has questions ever. So thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate it. Okay, so committee, so for the folks here in the middle of the room, we are going to do the noon Monday meeting, unless anybody has any objection to that. So noon on Monday. And then on Tuesday, committee, we're going to hear Senate Bill 208. I'm sorry? I'm sorry. We do an internal meeting to make sure we're set for the week. I apologize. Just these folks, the folks in the middle of the room. I apologize. Okay. So on Tuesday, the committee will meet in the committee room. Senate Bill 208 will be the subject. On Thursday, March 9th, we will be hearing 221 and 209, and depending on the will of the committee and what comes out of the hearing, we might work 208 on Thursday as well. Anything for the good of the order? Okay, if not, thank you everybody for bearing with me, and have a great weekend.